A single-room cabin stands alone on a Kansas prairie. They called it a homestead. It was also a stopover for travelers headed west. Inside, the table's always set and the coffee's always warm. I hear the family who lived there was very friendly. For a while, it was a welcome sight. Lots of weary travelers, until they stopped checking out. Between 1871 and 1873, a quiet homestead near Cherryvale became the center of one of America's most disturbing frontier mysteries. A German family calling themselves the Benders ran a frontier inn. Now, dozens of people vanished along a single stretch of the Great Osage Trail. Can you guess where they were last seen? When investigators finally opened a trapdoor beneath the cabin's floor, Kansas history changed forever. The real story isn't only about what they found, although don't get me wrong, what they found is as extraordinary as it is horrific. But the real story is about what came after. A manhunt that crossed state lines, a web of false identities, a century-long debate over who the Benders really were and whether they ever really faced justice. Because it kind of looks like they didn't. I'm John Genoa, this is America's Strangest History. Tonight we investigate the Bloody Benders. They ran an inn for around 24 months. In that time, lots of travelers checked in and never checked out. Let's take a look. The Kansas frontier in the early 1870s was a strange kind of crossroads. It's an unhealthy mix of promise and peril. The Civil War ended less than a decade earlier, and the government was opening up new tracts of land under the Homestead Act. This encouraged settlers to push west. The Great Osage Trail cut directly through what was called no man's land. Basically, it's a region located between civilization and the unpoliced wilderness beyond. Travelers used it constantly. Farmers, preachers, traders, families moving west, looking for a fresh start in new territories. But there was a problem. Once you left the safety of the rail lines and entered the open prairie, there were few places to rest, even fewer to eat, and worst yet, finding a place you can trust. That's where the Bender family appeared. They were newcomers. It's believed they were of German descent and that they arrived sometime between 1870 and 1871. They staked a claim about 7 miles outside Cherryvale, Kansas, and they built a modest one-room cabin divided by a heavy canvas curtain. Now, in the front part of the cabin was a general store. The Benders sold flour, coffee, or tobacco. Behind the curtain was the family's living quarters. To weary travelers, the Benders' homestead seemed like a blessing. They even had a small orchard out back. A hand-painted sign promised meals for travelers. There was always soup on the stove, and Kate Bender, young, educated, and said to be charming, claimed to be a spiritual healer who could speak to the dead. Got that? Locals called her Miss Katie, and she gave seances in the front room to attract both neighbors and strangers. And it worked. People came, and once they came, they often stayed for dinner. At first, nothing about the Benders seemed unusual. Settlers kept to themselves in those days. Suspicion was kind of a luxury when every family on the frontier was struggling to survive. But by 1872, rumors started to spread. Talk of travelers vanishing and wagons found abandoned along the road. Horses were discovered wandering back towards Independence without their riders. It wasn't until a respected physician named Dr. William York failed to return home from a trip along the trail in March 1873 that anyone connected the disappearance to the Benders. In the spring of 1873, the Osage Trail was a long dirt path cutting through vast stretches of prairie grass. But by then, the trail already carried a secret. When Dr. William York vanished, it drew the attention of people who mattered. York wasn't just another traveler. He was the brother of Colonel Ed York, a Civil War veteran and also a member of the Kansas State Senate. Colonel York knew how to use a search party, and he was dead set on finding his brother. He rode the trail himself. He stopped at every homestead and roadhouse along the route. He asked questions, took notes. One of those stops happened to be the Bender cabin. Kate Bender welcomed him with her usual enchanting warmth. She told York that many men went missing on the trail. It was full of thieves and other types of dangers. Then, in what might have been an act of bravado or even a strange confession, she offered to hold a seance to help him find his missing brother. Kinda weird considering, as far as Colonel York knew, his brother wasn't dead. York declined and left a bit unsettled. A few days later, he ran into another traveler who told him something that changed everything. The Benders were acting strangely. Their animals were starving in the pen. The store was locked and the cabin, it was empty. When a group of neighbors forced open the door, they found a half-eaten meal on the table and the smell of rotten decay under the floorboards. So they lifted a trap door. The space below wasn't deep, maybe around 6 feet, enough for a small cellar. It was empty, but the dirt looked disturbed. When they started digging near the orchard behind the cabin, their shovels struck something solid. By nightfall, they realized what they were uncovering wasn't a single grave. It was a field of them. They uncovered a killing zone. Word spread fast across Kansas. By the next morning, hundreds of people arrived by wagon and horseback. This was big news. People wanted to see it. No, they needed to see it. Sheriffs from nearby counties tried to keep order, but the site was already ransacked by the time police arrived. The place was picked clean. Every item in the cabin, the clock, the dishes, even the wallpaper was taken as souvenirs. The Bender homestead was disturbing. To investigators, it was also methodical. I'm talking about the arrangement of the cabin, like the placement of the table and the curtain dividing the room. The scene looked choreographed. For 2 years, people were eating dinner within a few feet of what would later be called Hell's Half Acre. When investigators started clearing the Bender property in May of 1873, they realized this wasn't the work of opportunists or outlaws. This was systematic, meticulous. The cabin's layout told the story. The table in the front room sat directly over a small trap door hidden beneath the carpet. Behind that, a curtain separated the guests from the family's sleeping area. It was a clever design. Travelers were invited to dinner and then sat with their backs to the canvas divider. The seat of honor was positioned closest to the trap door. Now, investigators found worn grooves in the wood. It was proof that the chair was pulled forward and replaced again and again and again. They pried up the boards and discovered congealed stains in the soil below. The ground under the floorboards was previously disturbed, repeatedly. Outside, digging around in the orchard, they found bodies. 9 confirmed graves, shallow, just enough dirt to cover a body. Each victim was buried face down with the head pointed towards the east. It was a deliberate pattern. Each skull showed a single blunt injury followed by an incision at the throat. One of the graves belonged to Dr. William York. Investigators identified him by the initials sewn into his collar. Now, the others included George Loncourt and his infant daughter Mary Ann. They'd been missing since 1872. There was also a stonemason named Johnny Boyle and several unidentified travelers. Now, one common theme: the travelers all carried small sums of valuables or tools. Newspapers speculated there may have been more than a dozen, but only 9 were confirmed by officials on the site. After the discovery, Cherryvale was chaos. Witnesses said more than 2,000 people converged on the Bender's homestead within 48 hours. Wagons arrived from as far as Topeka. I guess there were a lot of true crime fans back then, because souvenir hunters actually hacked away pieces from the Bender's cabin as mementos. They took so much it ended up collapsing under its own weight. The question nobody could answer was, who were the Benders? I mean, like, who were they really? Local property records listed John Bender Sr., about 60, and his wife Elvira, about 55, both immigrants from Germany. Their adult children, John Jr. and Kate, sometimes spoke English with much heavier accents than their parents. Kind of weird. It's a detail that later led detectives to suspect the family may not have been related at all. Kate was the public face of the group. Advertisements found in Independence and Fort Scott newspapers promoted her as a spiritual healer and clairvoyant. She offered to locate missing persons and cure ailments through magnetic forces. Investigators believe Kate's reputation as a skilled clairvoyant brought in many of the victims. Travelers would stop in for a reading, share a meal, and then disappear somewhere behind that curtain. They'd ultimately wind up in the orchard. Some of the neighbors recalled seeing the younger man, John Jr., hauling wagon loads of supplies to Independence every few weeks. He was always alone and never stayed long. John Jr. was known for quoting Bible verses about divine retribution, during which he often laughed at inappropriate moments. Governor Thomas Osborne issued rewards totaling nearly $3,000, a fortune at the time, for the capture of the 4 Benders. Posters described them in painstaking detail. John Sr., 5'8", gray beard, heavyset, speaks little English. Elvira, 5'5", coarse features, dark eyes. John Jr., tall, red-haired, about 25, fluent in English and German. Kate, mid-20s, attractive, educated, speaks freely, and claims supernatural powers. Colorful descriptions. Deputies followed wagon tracks north towards Kansas City, then west towards Denver, then south into Indian Territory. Every rumor brought a new posse. More than a dozen look-alike families were detained and released. None matched perfectly, and the real benders seemed to have vanished into the borderlands between Kansas and Texas. For months, newspapers ran articles about supposed sightings. A couple fitting the bender's description was captured near El Dorado, Kansas, then they were released after neighbors vouched for them. Reports of Kate pointed to the New Mexico territory, where she was purportedly working as a healer under a different name. A few Texas Rangers swore that the elder pair were killed by vigilantes near the Red River, but none of these reports were confirmed. The Kansas governor's files record dozens of telegrams from lawmen and bounty hunters, all ending the same way. Resembles description? Not certain. By winter 1873, the official investigation was exhausted. The state considered the case closed, but the legend was just beginning. The Benders' horrific crime shook frontier America to its core. Kansas was supposed to be the land of honest farmers and homesteaders. The realization that a welcoming immigrant family could operate what the newspapers called a frontier slaughterhouse turned public perception of the prairie upside down. Communities started forming vigilance committees. Residents went around demanding strangers prove their identities before settling. Inns and roadside stops were inspected by local militias. The Benders became the cautionary tale every westward traveler heard. Don't sit with your back to the curtain. Don't trust the kindness of strangers. Even as the cabin disintegrated and the orchard returned to weeds, reporters kept the story alive, with the added embellishment, of course. Each retelling grew stranger. The Benders were German spiritualists. The Benders were occultists from Pennsylvania. The Benders were Civil War refugees posing as kin. By the end of the century, the real people became folklore. By the summer of 1873, the Bender farm was gone. The cabin was stripped for souvenirs. The well was filled in. They cut down the orchard to keep looters away. But the story was just getting started. Every county in Kansas seemed to have its own version of what happened next. Some said a mob from Cherryvale caught the Benders trying to cross the border and then took justice into their own hands. There were reports that the family split up, that Kate and her brother were spotted in Texas posing as a married couple, while the older pair, they fled north under new names. In the absence of proof, the press filled in the void. The Kansas City Times ran headlines like "The Demon Den of the Prairies" and "The Kansas Family of Fiends." Illustrations showed the Benders as wild-eyed creatures. Their simple little cabin morphed into some gothic farmhouse. In reality, it was little more than a one-room shack. Still, the public was hooked. Newspapers as far away as New York, London, and Sydney ran the story. Each retelling added new victims and new details. The Benders were now frontier legends, the first so-called serial killers in American folklore, even though the term wouldn't exist for another century. Over the next 20 years, more than a dozen arrests were made across the United States, all claiming to be the missing Benders. In 1874, a pair of travelers arrested in Montana confessed under duress, only to be released when witnesses from Kansas said they weren't a match. In 1882, two women arrested in Michigan were believed to be Ma and Kate. They were held for months before the governor ordered their release, calling the identification inconclusive at best. Now, in 1889, a Texas Ranger claimed to have found Pa Bender's skull in a dry creek bed near the Red River. The discovery was never verified. Each supposed capture reignited the public fascination. The reward notices were reprinted for decades, and bounty hunters kept searching long after the official files were closed. The Kansas governor's office eventually stopped answering letters about the case. The state's final word on the subject was simple: the Benders disappeared, and they haven't been found. Of all the Benders, Kate became the most infamous. In life, she had positioned herself as a clairvoyant. She claimed the ability to speak to the dead through magnetic forces. After the family fled, newspapers turned that mysticism into villainy. They called her the Witch of the Plains. Pamphlets and dime novels of the 1800s painted her as a temptress, a prophet, even part killer. Yet researchers who examined the real court documents never found evidence that Kate killed anyone herself. Her seances, however, they may have provided the perfect alibi. It's a way to keep neighbors visiting while hiding what was happening behind the curtain. In Cherryvale, the Benderland became a destination for curiosity seekers. For decades, travelers stopped in to see the murder farm. They continued to take bits and bits of the foundation or the orchard fence as keepsakes. Local lawmen complained that the site had been picked clean before a proper forensic study could ever be done. By 1880, Kansas moved on. The railroads spread. The frontier was now farmland. The myth of the Benders turned into cautionary folklore. It became a warning about the dark side of isolation and unchecked opportunity. Still, questions lingered. Were they really a family? How many victims were there? And how did 4 people vanish from a region where every neighbor knew everyone else? Modern historians now suspect that the Benders may have split up and then escaped separately. They may have blended into immigrant communities under new names. Some suggest that the locals knew exactly what happened. Maybe vigilantes found them and then buried the evidence. Simple as that. Without bodies, records, or confessions, the truth, we could only speculate. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the Benders were no longer just fugitives, they were folklore. Their cabin, or the place it once stood, became a symbol. The simple homestead transformed into America's first ghost story about the frontier. The Bender case taught newspapers something powerful. Fear sells. The Telegraph made it possible for a small-town horror story to become national news overnight. It was, in effect, the birth of American true crime reporting. The Bender name became a narrative that Americans recognized instantly, evil disguised as hospitality. But the deeper legacy runs through how the case changed law enforcement and settler psychology. Before the Benders, most rural crimes were seen as isolated acts of desperation. Crimes like robbery, cattle rustling, or just an argument gone wrong. After the Benders, people began to accept the idea that some crimes were planned and methodical. Most disturbing, these heinous crimes were often committed by people who looked perfectly ordinary. Despite a century and a half of research, the mystery remains unsolved. No confirmed photograph of any Bender survives. There's no arrest record, no verified confession. There's no official autopsy report for most of the victims. Even the total number of people who vanished near the property is uncertain. 9 confirmed graves, but dozens of names appear in missing persons lists from 1871 to 1873. The most credible modern research suggests that the family may not have been a family at all. Not in the traditional sense. Linguistic analysis and immigration records hint that John Sr. and Elvira could have been unrelated German settlers who partnered up for financial convenience. John Jr. and Kate were likely unrelated. They possibly adopted the same surname to pass as a single household. A shared identity gave them cover. The Bender story also mirrored anxieties of the time. The frontier promised freedom, but that freedom came with isolation. Neighbors sometimes lived 10 miles or more apart. There were no telephones, no central law enforcement, no databases. If you disappeared, it might be weeks or longer before anyone ever noticed. That environment, sparse, trusting, self-reliant, made the Benders' evil possible. The Bender story is less about crime and more about the price of unchecked isolation. This is the same theme that echoes in later American legends, from Lizzie Borden to H.H. Holmes. Even today, descendants of the early Cherryvale settlers still debate what really happened. Some claim to have inherited relics from the site, bits of timber, rusted hinges, even bricks from the old foundation. Now, others insist the Benders never left Kansas at all. Maybe the town simply decided to stop talking about it. The Bender cabin is gone. The orchard is gone, but the story remains, along with a lot of unanswered questions. Who were they really? How many people disappeared? Why, after 150 years, is the truth so elusive? What do you think? Who were the Benders really? What happened to them? I'm John Genoa. This has been America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.